The year is 1348. The location is the high, jagged peaks of the Nagano Mountains in Japan, where the air is so thin it bites at your lungs and the frost never truly leaves the soil. Imagine a son, his skin leathery and gaunt from years of famine, his muscles trembling under an unbearable weight. He is not carrying a bundle of firewood or a bag of rice. He is carrying his own mother on his back. She is frail, her bones pressing against his spine like dry kindling. He is walking deep into the silent, suffocating wilderness to do the unthinkable, to leave her there, in the bitter cold, to die alone. This is the grim reality of Ubasute. In the remote, starving mountain villages of medieval Japan, this was not a crime. It was a ritualized survival strategy. When a parent grew too old, too frail, or too hungry to contribute to the labor required to scrape a living from the unforgiving earth, they were discarded. The sons who carried them up the mountain were not seen as murderers by their neighbors. They were seen as heads of households making a hard, necessary choice. They were practitioners of a cold, desperate calculus, a way to ensure that the limited calories remaining in the village could sustain the young, the strong, and those who still held the promise of a future. Why would a society that famously anchors its identity in filial piety and the profound respect for ancestors descend into such a harrowing practice? Was it an act of pure, unadulterated cruelty, or were these people pushed to the absolute periphery of human endurance by the relentless crushing force of civil war, widespread famine, and systemic poverty? To look at Ubasute is not to look a legend ghost story. It is to confront the terrifying fragility of human morality when the stomach is empty and the options are gone. We are not here to pass judgment from the safety of our modern era. We are here to peel back the layers of history and examine the precise, brutal economic logic that turns sons into the executioners of their own parents. This is a story of what happens when the bonds of family are stretched until they snap under the weight of survival. As we climb higher into these mountains, you must leave your modern comforts behind. Forget your belief that life is inherently sacred, and instead, see it through the eyes of a villager in 1348, who had to decide who would eat and who would freeze. The path is steep, the wind is screaming through the pines, and the summit is waiting. Once you reach the top, there is no coming back down. This is the story of how we decided that some lives were worth less than the food they consumed. The machinery of life in a 14th century mountain village was governed by a brutal, non-negotiable arithmetic. In the high altitudes of Shinano, the agricultural output was perpetually throttled by short, cruel, growing seasons and soil that refused to yield more than a fraction of what was required to sustain the population. To survive the winter, a household unit required a precise, unbreakable ratio of productive labor to caloric intake. When the warring factions of the Nanbokuko period moved through the valley, their requisitions were not merely taxes, they were death warrants. They took the rice, the seed for the coming spring, and the very hope of the household. What remained was a vacuum, and into that vacuum, the village elders were forced to descend. In this environment, the elderly were not revered keepers of wisdom. They were, in the most literal and devastating sense, dead weight. Their presence in the house was a constant, gnawing reminder of the shortage. Every cup of grain consumed by an aging parent who could no longer bend to the harvest was a cup taken from a child who was quite literally wasting away before their parents' eyes. The psychological toll of this existence is impossible to exaggerate. The village had become a prison where the walls were made of hunger and the ceiling was the indifference of a war-torn government. In such a state, the human mind undergoes a radical shift. Empathy is cauterized, replaced by a cold, utilitarian assessment of worth. This was not a decision born of malice. It was a decision born of absolute, suffocating necessity. Imagine the silence in the home the night before the trek. The fire is dying, the wind is howling, and the son looks at his mother, the woman who carried him, who fed him, who nurtured him, and sees only the math of survival. He knows that if she remains, the next month will see his own children suffer the slow, painful dissolution of starvation. He is not choosing to be a monster, he is choosing to be the guardian of his lineage, even if that guardianship requires him to commit the most profound act of betrayal. This is the tragic core of the tradition. The son who carries the mother to the mountain is not killing a stranger, he is sacrificing the foundation of his own history to ensure the survival of his future. The ritual itself was a perverse reflection of the love that once existed. It was not done in the dark, and it was not done with hatred. It was done with a somber, heavy ritualism that acknowledged the weight of the crime. The son would prepare a small pack, perhaps a bit of dried root or a gourd of water, and he would signal the time. The silence between them during the journey was not the silence of the hunt, but the silence of an executioner and the condemned, both of whom understood that the alternative was the total annihilation of the household. The physical exhaustion of the climb served as a distraction from the mental carnage. Every heavy step up the incline was a heartbeat closer to the end of the guilt-ridden struggle to provide for a family that simply could not be sustained by the land. When we analyze this, we are not looking at a primitive aberration. We are looking at the terrifying reality of what happens when the human collective is pushed past its limit. The villagers were ordinary people, bound by the same love and familial ties that define us today. The fact that they could perform the act of Ubasute is not proof that they were evil, it is proof that under enough pressure, the human capacity for morality is not a solid foundation, but a fluid concept. It bends, it fractures, and eventually, it breaks, replaced by the primitive, ironclad logic of the herd. To understand this is to acknowledge that if we were placed in their boots, in their famine, in their year of 1348, we might find ourselves walking the same path, carrying the same weight, and making the same impossible choice. The internal struggle of the son was not a moment of decision, but a slow, decades-long erosion of his own identity. From the moment he became the head of the household, he was haunted by the trajectory of his parents' decline. He watched them with a predatory focus, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, terrifying anticipation of the day. Their utility would drop below the threshold of their caloric cost. Every time his mother coughed, every time his father's pace slowed in the fields, he felt the cold hand of the inevitable gripping his chest. This was the psychological landscape of the Nagano Mountains, a life lived in the shadow of one's own future death, watching it play out in the faces of those you were sworn to protect. The burden of the climb was the final crystallization of this trauma. It was the ultimate performance of the societal contract. By taking his parent to the summit, the son was effectively purging the household of its past to save its future. Yet, the irony was cruel. In killing the past, he was destroying the very moral architecture that made life worth living. He was saving his children, but he was doing so by teaching them that there is an expiration date on human dignity. He was handing them a legacy of survival at the cost of their own humanity. The son knew that when his own time came, his children who were currently watching him walk his own parent to the mountain would be the ones carrying him. It was a cyclical, generational trauma, a repetitive motion of betrayal that kept the village alive, while systematically hollowing out the souls of its inhabitants. This cycle was reinforced by the communal nature of the act. Ubasute was not a private shame, it was an open secret, a tragedy shared by every family in the village. This collective participation provided a warped sense of validation. When everyone participates in the act, no one is the villain. By normalizing the abandonment, the villagers created a social buffer against the crushing weight of their own conscience. They shared the same stories of the mountain, the same justifications, and the same hollow expressions. They built a culture where the survival of the village superseded the survival of the individual, and where the right thing to do was to abandon those who could no longer serve the collective goal. This creates a terrifying picture of how a society functions when it is stripped of its excesses. In the absence of surplus, the higher emotions, gratitude, reverence, mercy, become unaffordable luxuries. They are the first things to be discarded, like ballast thrown overboard to keep a sinking ship afloat. We like to imagine that our morality is innate, that it would survive even the most harrowing conditions. But the history of the mountain villages suggests otherwise. It suggests that our morals are largely tied to our comfort. When that comfort is removed, when the hunger sets in, and when the survival of the next generation hangs in the balance, our morality proves to be nothing more than a fragile shell. The finality of the act was its most harrowing component. Once the parent was left behind, the son would begin the descent, alone. The walk back to the village was not a journey of relief, it was a journey of profound, irreparable loss. He was returning to a home that felt emptier, colder, and fundamentally altered. He had traded a person for a season of survival. He had paid for his children's existence with his own conscience. As he reached the bottom, he would look at his children, his hands still stained with the dirt of the mountain, and he would realize that he had saved their lives, but he had lost his way. He was now a stranger to himself, a survivor who had survived by discarding the very things that made his life meaningful. The legacy of the mountain summit is not found in the bones that were left to the snow and the scavengers. It is found in the scar tissue that formed over the collective soul of a nation. Ubasute was never merely a desperate act of survival, it foundational trauma that forced generations of people to define the value of a human life through the cold, unyielding lens of economic utility. We look back at these villages and we want to categorize them as primitive, as a relic of a dark and forgotten time, but that is a comforting lie. We categorize them as distant to avoid the realization that we are cut from the same cloth. When we strip away the veneer of our modern, resource-rich world, the logic of the summit remains a dormant specter. We have traded the physical mountain for the clinical sterility of the institution. But the question remains the same: at what point does the cost of maintaining a life exceed the perceived value of that life? We see this tension in our discussions on healthcare, in the treatment of the aging, and in the way we prioritize the productive over the vulnerable. The geography has changed, the tools of abandonment have been refined, but the fundamental arithmetic, the one that weighs human dignity against limited resources, is a recurring ghost in the machinery of civilization. The true tragedy of this history is that it reveals how easily the human spirit is subordinated to the environment. The son who carried his mother was not a villain, nor was he a hero. He was a creature of his circumstances, a person who did exactly what he believed he had to do to keep the lineage alive. By documenting this, we are not just observing a historical curiosity, we are documenting the breaking point of the human moral compass. We are acknowledging that the bonds of family are only as strong as the security that surrounds them. When that security fails, the most sacred relationships we possess can be sacrificed on the altar of necessity. This history demands a brutal confrontation with ourselves. It forces us to ask, what is the cost of our own survival? What are we willing to discard, to ignore, or to sacrifice when the famine comes, or when the system fails? The story of the Nagano Mountains is a mirror held up to the future. It warns us that our morality is not a permanent fixture of our identity, it is a precarious achievement, one that must be protected, nurtured, and fought for. If we lose the ability to see the inherent, non-negotiable value in those who can no longer contribute to the harvest, we are already walking up the path to the summit. The descent is always the hardest part. It is the moment you realize that the world you have saved is not the world you wanted to live in. We carry the weight of these choices in our silence, in our policies, and in the way we justify the abandonment of the weak in favor of the strong. The mountains of 1348 are quiet now, but the logic that built them is as loud as it has ever been. We are still counting the cost. We are still deciding who stays and who goes. And we are still pretending that we are not the ones carrying the burden, step by agonizing step, toward the cold, thin air of the peak. To the outside world, some of our traditions look like madness. Harakiri, Ubasute, the pacts with spirits. They defy modern logic, but there is a method to this darkness. I'm here to bridge the gap between your world and ours. If you're ready to face the truth behind the myths, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss what we're digging up next.